Okay, let's get started. My friends, as you know, historical context is critical to understanding what we conduct. You cannot separate the composer from the music. You cannot ignore the historical and autobiographical and geopolitical context of a work. Think of Eroica. Could it be possible to understand Eroica without first knowing Beethoven's opinion of Napoleon? Unlikely. So, what is the meaning then of understanding the Pathétique symphony? First, we must understand the pathétique in French and pathetic in English are not the same as Pateticheskaya in Russian. Pateticheskaya, a literary Russian word meaning full of pathos, impassioned, passionate, emotional. In the West, we have it referred to in French as pathétique, but it's not exactly the same translation. Therefore, to conduct the work, one must realize what Russian emotion is. Is it prone to depression, as Tchaikovsky was diagnosed as suffering from in 1892-93 when he was composing the work? And yet, most letters suggest he was happy, and composing was his catharsis. Therefore, is it a requiem, the pathétique? There's a famous phrase, death is a career move. Tchaikovsky was already famous, but it was his intention to create something that would crown his artistic career, as he wrote in a letter in 1889. In that year, only a year after completing his fifth symphony, Tchaikovsky wrote to his friend, the Grand Duke Konstantin Romanov, yes, those Romanovs, that I want terribly to write a somewhat grandiose symphony which would crown my artistic career. For some time, I have carried in my head an outline plan for such a symphony, and I hope that I shall not die without carrying out this intention. Tchaikovsky seems to have begun sketching his ambitious project in 1891, but by April 1892, he wrote to the pianist Alexander Zloty that I'm already thinking of a new large composition that is of a symphony with a secret program. So that leads us to the next important question in understanding and interpreting the symphony. What is the secret program? A version of the outline plan was found among Tchaikovsky's sketches for his next symphony, and it has a rather different trajectory. The ultimate essence of the symphony is life. The first movement, all passion, confidence, thirst for life, must be short. Finale, death is a result of collapse. The second movement is love. The third, disappointment, and the fourth ends dying away, also short. However, this plan for 1892 was a symphony in E flat, mi bemol, that remained incomplete. It was reconstructed and edited by Bogatyrev and became Tchaikovsky's unofficial symphony number 7. And the finale was not at all funereal or dying away. He abandoned the work, which later was included in an incomplete Piano Concerto number 3, and instead focused on a new version in 1893 of a symphony to follow this life theme. He wrote to his nephew, Vladimir Bob Davydov. During my journey, I had the idea for another symphony, this time with a program, but such a program that will remain an enigma to everyone. Let them guess. The symphony should be entitled a Programme Symphony number 6. The program itself will be suffused with subjectivity, and not infrequently during my travels, while composing it in my head, I wept a great deal. Upon my return, I sat down to write the sketches, and the work went so furiously and quickly that in less than 4 days, the first movement was completely ready. And the remaining movements already clearly outlined in my head. The third movement is already half done. The form of this symphony will have much that is new, and amongst other things, the finale will not be a noisy allegro, but on the contrary, a long, drawn-out adagio. You can't imagine how blissful I feel in the conviction that my time is not yet past, and that to work is still possible. That is the genesis and evolution of the work. But now, what about the secret? To the Grand Duke and patron, Konstantin Romanov, Tchaikovsky added, "Without exaggeration, I put my whole soul into this symphony, and I hope that your highness will approve of it. I don't know whether the symphony is original in terms of its musical material, but as far as its form is concerned, it does display an original feature in that its finale is written in adagio tempo, rather than allegro, as is normally the case." Is this the finale that ends by dying away, as described in the note from his sketches? Its marking of adagio lamentoso, slow and lamenting, and subdued ending would seem to confirm this conjecture. Furthermore, in the weeks before the premiere, the poet Alexei Apukhin, Tchaikovsky's lifelong friend and former schoolmate, passed away. Konstantin Romanov wrote to Tchaikovsky suggesting that he compose a musical setting of Apukhin's poem Requiem as an homage, but Tchaikovsky hesitated. I'm somewhat worried by the fact that my latest symphony, which I've recently completed and which is due to be performed on October the 16th, I should awfully like your highness to hear it, is suffused by a mood very close to that which pervades Apukhin's Requiem. I think that I've made a good job of this symphony, and I'm afraid of repeating myself if I were right now to embark on a composition which has an affinity with its predecessor in terms of spirit and character. After thoroughly studying the poem, he added in another letter that indeed my last symphony, especially the finale, is suffused by a similar mood. Tchaikovsky conducted the new symphony himself at the premiere, which took place in St. Petersburg in October 1893. Interestingly, the work was presented simply as Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, without a subtitle. For whatever reason, the symphony seems to have been coolly received by the audience. Tchaikovsky wrote, "Something strange is happening with the symphony. It's not that it displeased, but it has caused some bewilderment." Nevertheless, he continued to believe that it was his best work, his crowning achievement. But what was the secret? A requiem for his friend? Let us examine Tchaikovsky's death. Medical records suggest that Tchaikovsky died of cholera after drinking unboiled water. The Tsar gave him a state funeral. And the Sixth Symphony, after its premiere, which was not totally successful, became the final and universally embraced statement of Russia's greatest composer, and has remained since his greatest musical achievement to many. But did he die of cholera? Or was he, as some serious students of Tchaikovsky now contend, forced to commit suicide by a court of honor made up of his former classmates at the College of Law in St. Petersburg? The composer may have acted out of fear that he, and especially his family, would be disgraced if the fact of his homosexuality was made public. The Tsar already knew, and Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky's idol, might learn of it at any time. So runs the argument for suicide. In fact, the British musicologist David Brown states that he committed suicide cannot be doubted, but what precipitated this suicide has not been conclusively established. Brown goes on to say that the composer almost certainly died of arsenic poisoning. The story that he died of cholera from drinking unboiled water is a fabrication. If Brown is right, the official story of Tchaikovsky's death can only have been a classic cover-up, a conspiracy involving his brother Modeste. doctors and others close to the composer in his final days. Modeste himself, also homosexual, may have had a special interest in keeping his brother's secret. Whatever the climate of acceptance may have been in certain clandestine circles, it is indisputably so that homosexuality in his time was a criminal offense. The actual wording of the criminal code of the Russian Empire, as published in 1842, 1866, and 1885, reads, the punishment for homosexuality was lashing with birch rods, deportation to Siberia, and loss of all civil rights. No wonder Tchaikovsky, at age 37, tried marriage. He left his bride after 9 days. And in letters to Modeste, urged his brother to take a similar step in hopes of protecting the family name. It does not take a tremendous leap of imagination to conceive of such a tortured man committing suicide to keep the truth from coming out. And yet, would this idea have manifested into the mood of the work? Clearly, the theme of life with a fading away is not necessarily contingent upon suicidal tendencies. And cholera was quick. He would not have proposed his own self-requiem if dying from cholera. There was another reason. And my friends, I may have an answer. His homosexuality is indeed a key to understanding. Tchaikovsky struggles with his sexuality throughout his life, with a failed marriage and many letters attesting to his unhappiness. He even considered it something that could be cured. Was it suicide? In the end, I do not believe it was. However, rumors persist that Tchaikovsky took the poison on orders from his old classmates, who had convened a hasty court of honor after learning that of his liaison with the nephew of Duke Stenbock-Turmor. The Duke had written a letter of protest to the Tsar, bringing the matter of Tchaikovsky's sexual carryings-on to the point of official scandal. Therefore, whether suicide or cholera, was Tchaikovsky aware of his inevitable fate and composed his own requiem in advance? Or was it more a philosophical, psychological, even literary portrait of his own inner suffering? I find this more plausible, as composers are autobiographical in their musical paraphrasing. Think of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, or Schumann's Fourth Symphony, Dvorak's New World Symphony, Strauss's Tod und Verklärung, and so on. We can look to Tchaikovsky's own Fatum from 1868. Tchaikovsky originally wrote this tone poem to his own very abstract program dealing with the cruelty of fate in people's destinies. Tchaikovsky himself was not satisfied with the outcome. Indeed, he destroyed the orchestral score, which was reconstructed from a set of parts after he died. And while there are some musical similarities with the Symphony No. 6 and a wonderful C minor allegro fate melody, perhaps Beethovenian, if you can say such a word, giving it an admirable impression, but it is not the main source for his pathétique, nor its secret meaning. What else might have given Tchaikovsky an inspiration? One of the playwrights of whose work he saw a great deal was Shakespeare, who during Shakespeare's lifetime had rapidly risen to the position of being among the most performed writers on the Russian stage. In 1830, the critic Pletnev had asked in his Thoughts on Macbeth, why read other writers when Shakespeare contains them all? And when Pushkin wrote his Little Tragedies, he had openly adopted Shakespeare as his model. But it was the performance of Hamlet, given by the great actor Pavel Mokhalov in Moscow in 1837, which was the decisive event in establishing Shakespeare on the Russian stage. In the 19th century until the 1840s, Russian art had been lost aimlessly trying to base itself on French models or on Walter Scott. But when the true unadulterated unmutilated Shakespeare was shown in Russia by Mokholov, wrote the Russian-American critic Isaac Don Levine, spiritual Russia, as if at the touch of a magic wand, awakened. The critic Belinsky noted that since Mokholov, Russians understand that there is but one dramatic poet in the world, and that is Shakespeare. Well, we know from Romeo and Juliet that Tchaikovsky was fascinated by unrequited love and impossible loves and romantic loves that ends with death. The fantasy overture in its final version has become the highest ideal of passionate romantic Russian music. In The Tempest, Tchaikovsky summons up the magic island in the marine world in ravishing orchestral colors, while the lover's music, tender and restrained, almost chaste, rises to heights of amorous intensity beyond anything to be found in the play. Hamlet, 15 years later, equally derives from 19th century views of the play, in this case, as a cosmic statement about human nature. Tchaikovsky's own brother, Modeste, suggested the play, but the program was Tchaikovsky's own, drawing from him a massively impressive portrait of a romantic outsider, a Byron, or indeed a Pechorin from Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time, or an Onegin. The character of Hamlet itself had acquired, since Mokholov's trailblazing performance, a particular resonance for Russians. The indecisiveness, the sense of doom, the constant introspection seemed to them to express the very essence of the Russian soul. As it happens, Tchaikovsky also wrote a very serviceable score for a production of Hamlet in St. Petersburg some years later. In fact, the Hamlet overture, which was very popular in Tchaikovsky's life, has some remarkable similarities to the Pathétique. So Shakespeare, and Hamlet in particular, had an indelible impact on Tchaikovsky's imagination. And if we combine this influence with his own insurmountable personal tragedies of living as a gay man and an impossible love for which he was exposed, might it be clear that Hamlet could have once again captured his consciousness and dictated that musical idea of the symphony and the outcome of that final adagio, that dying away? Already in the opening of the first movement, and I urge you all to go to your scores now, we feel the same tragic mood of Hamlet. The opening mournful bassoon line is typical of funeral music since the Baroque. The opening passage, with its descending chromaticism, is most deeply expressed in the upbeat to measure 5 in the violas. Da da ti da. Measure 11 with more anguish, and in measure 13, and again with the upbeat to the ritenuto in measure 17, before the fermata and close of the introduction. Suddenly, the allegro non troppo begins with the violas, having to take care with their intonation, something you need to rehearse. But it is the celli that need a clear entrance on the 4th beat of measure 28, leading into the exceptional 2/4 bar before letter A, and the upbeat of the same tragic motive, heard in the bassoon and violas in the first violins this time, with more agitation, leading to a high-held note in espressivo in measure 38. Make sure it's espressivo. As the strings start the saltando, don't ignore the legato phrasing of the wind melodies. After letter B, B for Beethoven, give a crescendo to the bassoon, to the high sol diez, the G sharp, and make sure the horns do not drag the espressivo hairpin. With an un poco animando in measure 67, The brass fanfare moves forward after the third beat, taking care to make the quarter notes tenuto in phrasing. Give a good entrance for the timpani at measure 70 on beat 3. The third beat becomes important in the poco più animato to letter D, and following for the trombones in measures 81 and 82. The ritardando molto should be rehearsed and observed with a cantabile cello melody, allowing time to slow from triplets to duplets before the violas, with great care and intonation once again, remind us of that earlier anguish before the fermata. But of course, it is the famous andante melody that helps us understand the anguish. And it also reminds us of another impossible love. I wonder if anybody can guess it right now. Well, it's Don Jose for Carmen. In fact, Tchaikovsky loved Carmen. And this melody, starting in measure 89 and repeating throughout the movement, bears a very strong resemblance to Don Jose's Flower Song from Carmen. And both melodies begin with a falling triadic line. And when the melody leaps up to a descending scale, it recalls the phrase when Don Jose sings, Car tu n'avais eu que paraître, que jeter un regard sur moi, pour t'emparer de tout mon être. For you had only to appear, only to cast a glance at me, to take hold of all my being. Tchaikovsky marks this part incalzando, which, as we all know, can mean urging or pressing. Careful of the upbeat to the moderato mosso. The eighth note equals the following quarter note. So you need to give either a good clear upbeat or even a subdivision so the orchestra understands the new tempo. The winds should speak as actors do, with character and with meaning. At measure 105, do not ignore the trombones and trumpets with the ascending and descending tenuto quarter notes. At issue is always the septuplet before letter E and after. Is it a crescendo or is it a diminuendo? Of course, it's written as a crescendo, but most orchestras play it as a diminuendo. The difficulty of the intonation has led to the diminution of the phrase, but it does have musical logic. Note at measure 121, the saltando evolves to a tragic tenuto alla corda and a final fortissimo before the winds remind us of the viola adagio melody of the introduction. The suffering increases. Our andante melody with a generous triplet upbeat for all to play, the triplet pesante and non staccato, becomes even more passionate. The moderato needs a good cue for the second violin to double the firsts. The clarinet and bassoon phrase the two-note slurs. Let that play out a little bit so we can hear the melodies. And finally, the clarinet gives us our melody like a fading memory. Note the first time at Adagio Mosso, the eighth note upbeat, and the echo has a 16th note upbeat. The question of the bass clarinet substituting for the bassoon on the four descending eighth notes in fermata is most likely due to the limitations of the bassoon players at that time. Today, most bassoon players can play it, and they would want to. So if they do, it's best not to conduct, but to let the bassoon simply play the notes slowly or in fermata as comfortably as they can. If it is a bass clarinet, let the bass clarinet do the same. Then the explosion. How to prepare this alarm clock for the audience. Some of you have probably seen the video where the conductor gets to this moment and somebody screams in the audience. You need to sustain the silence, but you give a clear neutral 1-2 before the fortissimo upbeat to generate such force. Some people just give an ictus and it will still work, but you can be safe giving a neutral 1-2. The cello and contrabass play off the string sextuplets. It's quite aggressive, almost violent. The upper strings play from the string, not lifting the bow so much after the tied note to connect the phrase. Often you'll hear off. Be careful not to let them raise the bow too much. You can also ask for more weight from the index finger to the bow. They'll have more pressure. At letter H, we have a similar musical fugue heard in Romeo and Juliet, another impossible love. Ask the violas to play on one string, soldo. The upbeat to measure 190 is like a cannon blast, but the trumpet needs a clear downbeat, and the sound should be above the rest of the orchestra if possible, Russian style, even espressivo. At measure 201, we hear later a quotation of the Russian Orthodox chant in the trombones, with thy saints, O Christ, give peace to the soul of thy servant. It's a traditional prayer for the dead. Tchaikovsky already anticipates his demise. At letter L, don't rush and allow a beautiful sound, but phrase the strings across the bar lines, following the brass quarter notes. A clear cue to the horns at measure 223 is important to prepare them for what is to come at letter M, a foreshadowing of the adagio andante, but in this case with more hyperventilation. Ta, 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 ta. The strings are sul tasto, in shadow. For the opening tragic motive. Note the upbeat in this exciting passage at measure 249 is only forte, then fortissimo with measure 253. The upbeat to 263 after a huge crescendo requires the military trumpets and triplets to be above the orchestra again. Finally, passion with a capital P at letter P, Pateticheskaya, is heard in the second beat with pesante brass and timpani, with bells up in measure 269. In measure 270, it is recommended to follow the revisions in the score for the timpani to make a crescendo rather than diminuendo. In fact, what is most striking is the use of the timpani after these Romeo and Juliet syncopations before letter Q. While the original draft has a diminuendo leading to the climax, most conductors demand a crescendo to lead dramatically into this pleading, screaming section, but only in forte. Many bow changes are needed from letter Q, remaining in a beat of 2 half notes. The tension builds in measure 284, then beating in 4 with the timpani crescendo. The trombones are sustained in the slower tempo in 4. The final fortissimo chord, 3 after letter R, is the resolution, with the timpani following the pizzicati in the celli and bassi like nails in a coffin. After a long, exhausting fermata, you have a clear 1 to the celli and bassi for this arco entrance, and we return to the andante melody like a nostalgic but unfulfilled memory of love. The ritenuto with the horns in measure 315 to the 3rd beat is the denouement. The subdivided upbeat of the winds to the andante mosso should be clear. The 8th note of the preceding adagio becomes the quarter note. The pizzicati are in tempo, but deep, heavy, and dry. Boom, 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 boom. From the chest, like the mirkiznak, soft sign in Russian pronunciation. Not Italian pizzicati. Tat, 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 rrr. From the tongue. From the chest. Give an early entrance to the trumpets of the funeral band, but remind them, please, not to get too loud in the hairpin. At measure 350, the trombones need a cue, allowing the celli and bassi to slow down and accompany the last 8th notes of the trombone's final chord. Bum, 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 bim, bum. The ending of the movement with the timpani is a prescient foreshadow of the final adagio, the bass pizzicati, not like nails, but instead the throwing of dirt onto a grave. And that's the first movement. Second movement. How's everybody doing? Following okay? It's not too fast for you? Somebody give me a thumbs up.
No, it's fine.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have measures, but only A, B, C, and the cues.
I'm so sorry that
no, it's fine. I can follow along.
But I think you have an idea if you know the symphony, and I think you can understand what I'm referring to. Thank you, Hans. Thank you. Go back to mute if you don't mind. So let's go on. Second movement. Reminiscent of the composer's ballet music, the second movement theme would seem to be a waltz, except that's in 5/4 rather than the usual 3/4 time, as you know. Some commentators have poetically suggested that this is a waltz missing a beat. But while its meter is unusual, the melody sounds utterly complete as it is. What is most important is the internal triplet, meant to slow down the crescendo and to allow an eloquent, graceful turn. The idea of the 5/4 becomes like a souvenir, a memory of good times past, and in a life that had some happy moments, although overshadowed by the complexity of the unpredictable and impossibility of love. It's best to rehearse and conduct the celli with a 2+1+2 gesture. The triplet being a circular upbeat to the 2 quarter notes leading to the next measure. Dee-da, dee-da-da, dee-da, dee-da, dee-da-da, dee-da. If you're only in 5, it's a little too pedantic, and if it's too big, the risk is that they may rush the triplet. Once they get it, they get it. You don't have to do it every single time. But it's very helpful. And when taking the repeat, allow the cello to play, and you simply accompany the eighth notes in a round 3 pattern. Measures 17 and 21 are often played with a portamento in the strings between the first and second quarter notes. Tia. Also in measures 112 and 116, Hans, I think you know where we're talking about. The winds do not make the glissando at letter A, however. It is advised in measure 33 and measure 127 to conduct in 5 to ensure the pizzicati and strings are together after the third beat in between. 1, 2, 3, pa, pi, pa, 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 pa. So that it's very clear for them where these pizzicati need to be placed. And you stay in 5 until the arco melody returns, at which a quarter plus dotted quarter fluid gesture allows for a luxurious and generous sound. The trio acts like a yearning, a Sehnsucht auf Deutsch, with an internal sigh from the seconds and violas to complement the repeated hairpin melody of the violins and celli. We hear ti-ta-ti-da, ti-ta-ti-da, but the internal seconds and violas are interesting. Di-pa-pa-ti-da, di-a-ta-ti-da. That makes it more interesting. Once the woodwinds take the theme, the pizzicati are less like ballerina toes, fluttering to the music, but instead running away from the fate of not being able to live the love desired. The return to the main theme at letter H comes with a logical and traditional ritardando and diminuendo rather than the printed crescendo. Look, I've done it both ways. Da da dee da da dee da da, going into it with a crescendo. But most conductors, including my teacher Musen, even Lenny and many others, make the ritardando and diminuendo. It seems that it's coming out of some kind of dream, going back into the main theme. At letter M for Maria, articulate the horns, but do not separate them. In measure 148, 149, you need a little bit of panache, conducting in 5 to be precise. Letter N, Nazdrovia, is like a church chorale in the winds and brass. You stay in tempo to allow the accented dotted half note to not drag. At letter O for Obama, the wind soil are espressivo, expressive. The winds, this wind texture is expressivo, full of individual character, arriving to the clarinet and first violins, reminding us of a reflection of the waltz theme and trio theme. An even further imposed rallentando allows the final, almost arpeggiated pizzicato and chord, as if saying adieu, farewell. Second movement. Let's go on to the third movement. The third movement, a march, is always received by the public as if it's the finale, with an enormous applause to follow, as most of you know. But the march has a different meaning. It's not unlike the march to battle, but it is instead another reference to an impossible love. Think of the Marche au Supplice from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, his own symphonic fantasy of loss of love, and the inevitable hallucinatory march to the guillotine. I might add that it was also Shakespeare that Berlioz saw Harriet Smithson perform, and that's what created his idée fixe, his fixation and obsession and love with Harriet, their marriage doomed as it would be. All the downward scales are like a vortex of energy drowning our musical hero. You would be best to start in 2 to have the vivace tempo. It is not only fast, it is vivacious. You can, of course, rehearse slowly in 4. You can do it slowly in 4, but that's not going to give you the tempo. It's more important that you establish quickly for the players what that tempo will be. You must pay attention to the violas at the end of measure 2 and the contrast in winds between triplets and duplets. Pia, pia. And then what comes, where you have the fagot, like Tchaikovsky ballet. The main theme, first in the oboe, then in the strings, must be continuous without breaks. The strings, like in the first movement, they can play close to the string across the bar line without releasing the bow, as was done in the first movement. Measure 117 is important to give a clear ictus on beat 2 for a secco pizzicati in the strings. 1 and 2, pits. The same for measure 155 when it repeats. Measure 35 and also 174 for pizzicati and the piccolo entrance in measure 36 and 175 are very important. Lead the piccolo with direction in the crescendo. Lead the piccolo. And it's the same for the staccato trombone that follows. The upbeat to 45 and 446 after letter E, that is Edward, and the parallel after letter S, as in Superman, are not references to Beethoven's Fifth by accident. Fate plays an important part in this symphony, as it is in much of Tchaikovsky's music, and we're given this motive as an example in the way Brahms did the same in his first symphony. The knocking on the door, ta-ta-ta-ta, is also reinforced by the forte marcato string melody. And interestingly, is the note E flat, ta 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 ta, played with full bow. A coincidence here, coming from his earlier E flat symphony, or even stretching it a little bit further in E flat, it's a Eroica, a nod to motherland Russia defeating Napoleon. Who knows? Accented winds from letter G, Gustav, are like church bells in crescendo. The clarinet and bassoon in duplets are heard without diminuendo, leading into the main march at letter H. After the fanfare at letter K, the down bows played at the frog, au talon, need to be shown this by your conducting gesture. Show them how they would play the down bow from your gesture. The winds echo the violas from measure 2, and the long hairpins in the winds and bassi are expanded to include brass, even the tuba in the recapitulation after letter BB, that's BB King. After letter T, and the brass played fortissimo. The timpani also has a crescendo to the second beat of measure 194, and a long diminuendo, leading a clear entrance of the celli in misurato and the bassoons in pianissimo. The march motive is exchanged among sections. You must pay attention to the second violin entrance at measure 203. Give a cue for the second violins. And you give a clear forte downbeat to the triplets of the bassi at letter V for victoire. Horns are then played above the orchestra, and the trombones and horns and strings are sustained in crescendo from measure 214. At letter X, that's X for X-Men, the Gran Casa comes in with a crash, and the scales of the strings and winds are played like a whip to the second beat. Like whipping the beat. Letter Y is played a tempo with the half notes held long. Hold them long. Give good cues for the cymbals, who finally play with an even greater crash at letter Z. At letter DD, don't let the bass drum be too loud in its tremolo. It fills the space with the timpani to create an earthquake with the brass fanfare until the famous moment at EE, that's double E, letter E. You conduct in 4, slowing down for a giant cymbal crash on beat 4, and then you continue in a maestoso march, as was done in Soviet times, almost half tempo of the primo tempo. Dim dum dum psh, dum dum da dum dum da dee, dum da 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 da. Then the march remains in 4 from measure 283 until measure 289, with the upbeat being a half note and the music returning to a tempo primo in 2. You have to give that upbeat. You go back to tempo. 1, 2. Yep. You take care not to be too loud with trumpets at letter HH, but allow a poco a poco crescendo until the fortissimo at measure 312, the Gran Casa Q at 313, and the cymbals after a strong beat 2 in measure 315. At letter II, follow the ascending strings and the melodic brass. KK becomes a circular beat to maintain the tempo and energy, especially with the offbeats, 3 after KK. LL needs short brass 8th notes, played secco. However, the descending brass from measure 338 should not be too staccato, but instead with phrasing, still in 2, until the final punctuated chords in a beat of 4 from measure 341. Ba, 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 ba. Give them in 4. At last, the whole note chord returns to a beat of 2 half notes. Ba. After a strong second beat, release is a final reminder of Beethoven and the force of destiny. Yatatatam. Audiences agree with a predictable eruption of applause. Third movement. We go on. The emotional finale is played attacca, ostensibly to drown out the clapping of the public, but more likely as an emotional outpouring, a deep sadness, with the melody intertwined between firsts and seconds, like 2 bodies unable to separate. And more likely, an internal dialogue within Tchaikovsky. The gay man versus the noble composer in society. 2 worlds separated, two personalities in conflict. How ingenious of the composer to include his own internal drama inside the dialogue of the strings. It is important to note that adagio was an afterthought. It's important to know that the symphony is particular in that it is the only one of all his symphonies when Tchaikovsky gave actual metronome markings. It's very important for you all to know that. The only symphony that Tchaikovsky actually gives metronome markings. The finale was originally andante lamentoso. The quarter note equals 54. But if you start too fast, that would not contrast with the important andante at 76 that follows. So it makes sense that it would be an adagio lamentoso to arrive to an andante. Therefore, you interrupt that inevitable applause after the third movement, and you start with a big breath and conduct in 6 to show the dialogue between the seconds and the firsts, and to make sure the tenuto 16th note is pronounced. Di, di, da, di, ah, bam, ba. Then in a slow adagio 3. Then the phrasing between beats of 6 and 3 are predominant until the affrettando, hastening in 3 towards the rallentando after letter A. The phrasing of the tenuto wins, emphasizing the internal hemiola, is heavy. Finally, where printed andante at 69, the winds allow for a subdivision to articulate this quasi-appoggiatura, di-da-da-da-di, as a turn until the end of the phrase. Then, at the adagio poco meno che prima, a clear, neutral downbeat must be given. 1. Then a subdivision of the second beat to allow for all strings to enter, leading to a repeat of the 6 pattern and 3 pattern alternation. 1, 2, da di da di da di da di. After letter B for bassoons, the bassoons are in 3. The ponderous pesante rhythm of the a due bassoons are in 3 until measure 34, when the 16th notes are subdivided. Measure 35 must show the second horn clearly, each beat until the end of the phrase, with a cutoff on the 8th note after beat 3. The 8th note, rest, is often held like a fermata before the following triplet andante. So you cut off, you wait, and you give a breath in a triplet for the horns so that they know the tempo. This is the walk down the colonnade to the light at the end of the tunnel. The horns need that clear breath with the triplet upbeat to get the correct tempo and maintain it over the tied notes. The violins are marked con lenezza e devozione. Lenezza, interestingly, is not a standard Italian word. I think if Lorenzo or any other Italians are on this seminar, you can probably agree. Some believe it's a misspelling of lentezza, slowness, although others have suggested it might be an obscure literary variant of lenità, soothing. Devozione means devotion or piety, carrying a religious connotation. So it's quite an interesting thing to understand for your own interpretive analysis. The melody is one of surrender, resignation, acceptance. Careful to not rush the animando. Let it all flow naturally in a paraphrase. I'm even reminded of Dylan Thomas's poem, "Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night." Well, we do not go quickly into that good night either. Pull back to tempo primo of the andante to build more tension. At measure 54, the ritenuto of the trumpets must be sustained to return the horns into the andante tempo, and the violins are more expressive. They too make a huge sustained ritenuto before letter E for Edward. Stretch the melody even more until finally the animando leads to letter F. This più mosso is the last chance for Tchaikovsky to scream, "Why me?" Hold the eighth notes, then go forward with the triplets until finally the stringendo articulates the descending hemiola. In triplets from measure 77 through vivace until the beat slap. You hold the fermata frozen. You give an upbeat on the third beat of measure 82, another upbeat at 84, even more exhausted. After the fermata of 86, give the third beat for the upbeat and cut off after a full quarter note. The same for measure 88. Upbeat on beat 3 to 89, give the downbeat, and as before, subdivide after beat 2, leading into letter G. But this time, the andante non tanto is in 3. Leave the horns after measure 97. It's advised to have all horns play, not only second and fourth, from measure 98, in order to hear them well, cutting them off one before H, after the third beat, in subdivision, as this cutoff should be in the tempo of the incalzando of the following measure, with the downbeat of letter H already in the tempo of the eighth note subdivision. 3 and 1 and 3 and 1. But this time the third beat is a full quarter note upbeat to the fortissimo continuing in tempo. At 5 before H, start in 3, piano dolce, and continue to increase the crescendo and the passion in the stringendo molto, with once again the hemiola starting at measure 112 on the first beat, then third, then second in the next measure, then again first and third in measure 114, until the second beat of the fortissimo in measure 115 at moderato assai, with the strings in misurato, then tremolo on letter I, then misurato from B2 in measure 117, then tremolo in measure 118, and so on, increasing the tempo through incalzando until, as advised, the upbeat to 1 before K as half string misurato, the other half tremolo, to create both intensity and articulation in the ritenuto. So again, we've done this, we've talked about this before in master classes, to create this intensity and this clarity. Inside, outside, on the stand, doing something different. Half playing misurato, la 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 la. Others playing tremolo. It creates an intensity like you cannot believe. Letter K, we arrive at Hamlet's shuffling off the mortal coil. The horns are gestopft, brassy, metallic in their fortissimo accents. With each third beat, string upbeat, the tempo is held back. And finally, at measure 133, the strings, like Tchaikovsky himself, are exhausted in temperament. The second beat, low horn, as always, stays in this nasal, brassy sound in fortissimo until the printed diminuendo, but still present always as the body casts off its exoskeleton. The tam-tam at letter L is the final judgment. The trombones are a funeral chorale. And by the way, you can hold that tam-tam for a fermata if you like. It doesn't have to be in tempo. You can let it resonate. The trombones are a funeral chorale, the instrument symbolic of spiritual piety. Lower and lower, the tuba is given on beat 3. The final chords are 4 and 5, P, 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 P. The epilogue begins. Here lies Peter Tchaikovsky. Alas, the secret of the symphony now becomes clear. Modern horns, invented in 1839, have rotary valves and piston valves, initially aimed to overcome problems associated with changing crooks during a performance. Antoine, if you're going to do the pathétique with your period horns, be aware of this. These coiled rotary valves are heard with a metallic sforzando deep in the bell, gestopft, creating a unique character consistent with Hamlet's quote, devoutly to be wished to die to sleep perchance to dream. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. There is a precedent for this. The tam-tam and the same stuffed sforzando horns are used in the Hamlet overture. The valves resemble a coil, just as a snake would shuffle off its skin. So too might Tchaikovsky have wished to shuffle off the stain of his sexuality. The coil, a metaphor for skin, would be to rid oneself of an affliction and dreamily die, free of suffering. Therein, in my opinion, lies the secret. Hamlet was the inspiration and source. The bassi are steadfast, the sound of inevitability, with the heartbeat triplets that do not stop until the end. The outpouring of strings, again in dialogue, are this time the cries of all who mourn their hero. Just before the end, the sforzando and the boucher horns of measure 152, with the clarinets, the soulful instrument from the first movement, are the last vestiges of life. The last breaths in sforzando and the celli before the curtain falls. And the finally syncopated rhythms with pizzicato and long-held B minor are the final breaths before the silence. The soil is thrown on the mortal coil. As the final line of Hamlet says, if it be now, it's not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. The rest is silence. Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. The rest is silence. That, in my humble opinion, is the meaning of the symphony. Any questions? As Candide would say, as Voltaire would say. Any questions?
Excuse me. I don't know how to raise my hand in Zoom.
Please go ahead. Unmute yourself one at a time if you have a question.
I have a
How are
question
you,
for the
David?
in the starts of the third movement, there are the
Yep.
strings, and
Yep.
there's accents in the third measure, I think. Yeah.
Yep.
There a crescendo leading to the accents, hypothetically.
Leading to the third measure, or
Yes.
the accents. The accents. You have accents in measure 3. Morgan, you have accents in measure 3.
Excuse me, I'm just finding the start of the third movement. Here we go. Yeah, at the end of oh no, excuse me, the
You
fourth.
mean measure
The fourth.
4? Measure 4.
Yes, the fourth.
Yes, you have these accents. They're really just to be able to give clarity of your first and second beats. Remember, I said it's vivace. You have to be very clear from the very beginning. Morgan, why don't you do this with me right now? Show me how you would start the third movement. Yeah, you need to give a much clearer second beat for an ictus so that everybody understands how they're going to put 6 notes, 2 triplets into that one beat. They have to think about that. Give a clearer second beat. Try again.
I do this in 4.
Yeah, if you do it in 4, you're going to get tired with this tempo of allegro molto vivace. You can rehearse in 4, but you really should be conducting in 2.
Okay, perfect. So
Okay.
there is no.
And when you make those accents, it's really just to emphasize, like a whip, what that tempo is, so everybody stays in tempo.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Go ahead and mute yourself. Any others? Jonathan.
Yeah, it seems kind of a banal question after this precise analysis of Hamlet and everything else, but I'm just curious, after the third movement, specifically, let's say you're in performance and yes, the audience erupts. What is your reaction? Do you just stay in the emotion? Do you mentioned something about Attacca, are you trying to interrupt?
Well, it's a very good question. Some people just let the audience clap. And then the conductors will put their hands up. Audience will, recognize something's about to happen. But I think the idea is to understand the relationship between the third movement and the fourth movement. That there's this guillotine, of fate. And then this outpouring of emotion. Think of the emotion. Some of them would be cheering. But the nobles who had to witness Marie Antoinette get her head cut off, think of the gasps and screams coming from their mouths. So I think that the point is that once the orchestra starts playing, the audience shuts up very quickly. But you have to dramaturgically invite the audience to go along with you for the reason why you would make it Attacca. If you stop and you let everybody clap, and then you give dee da 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 da, yeah, it's musically there, but it loses some of the dramatic purpose. It's not written Attacca, and for that reason, there's no official answer. But because people do clap a lot after the third movement, thinking that it's over, some people even stand up, walk out. That's why people have really gone quickly into the fourth movement so that they not only stay in their seats, but that it does have some dramaturgical purpose.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Other questions? Put yourself on mute, Jonathan. Anybody else?
Maybe just one remark on the last topic. I think that during that time of writing, there was actually no really habit of when to clap. I think this comes later, more actually at the beginning of the last century.
You're absolutely right.
There was no rule, no habit to clap or not to clap. This was just an emotional or a kind of. I know there were some habits in the French, Französischer Hof. I don't know the French. You know what I mean, Französischer Hof.
Yeah.
There were kind of.
I will tell you.
To wait until the king shows.
You're right. You're absolutely right. But you must remember that Tchaikovsky was writing ballets also for the royals.
Sure.
And the royal family in Russia, the Tsar's family, spoke French. And so this tradition actually also came over to Russia. And during the ballets, there were so many scenes, people started getting used to not clapping between the different scenes. So it was predictable that there would be some form of piety or etiquette or quiet in the concert hall, even at this time. But remember, during the premiere of this piece, people were a little bit confused for an adagio to finish rather than a finale like that. Yes, Nikolai. Unmute yourself, Nikolai.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Yeah, just actually one question, quite technical question from the first movement in M, Matilda. you know, kind of technically we go on with the tempo 144, right? And but somehow the feeling of the phrase is a little bit maybe less agitato. So how would you cope with the horns? Because you know this is sometimes quite of a challenge for them to keep the
Sure.
rhythm.
Well, it all depends on, as I said earlier in the discussion. Do you have measure numbers?
Yeah.
Yeah. So look at measure 220. I think it's 3,
Mm-hmm.
where the horns come in. Ba, bee, pa, pa, pa. You're already establishing the tempo with the horns there. So by the time the horns continue with the syncopations from measure 226, da dee pa 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 pa, they're already in tempo. What
So
most people, there's no ritardando written. Some people relax the tempo going into letter M, but then the horns have a little bit of confusion what tempo they should play. You have 2 measures to allow that tempo to relax a little bit once they start after letter M. But it's more advisable to have the tempo already established from 3 measures before, or even just 1 measure before M, to have the measure already established. Because your celli and contrabassi will just follow. That's not the issue. Your issue is, first of all, creating the tempo as needed and the harmonic change one before letter M. Look what's happening in your trombones, that harmonic change. You have to make sure that they're clear on the tempo as well for your trombones. So if the horns are clearly da, 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 trombones, everybody knows where the 1 is. So when you finally arrive at letter M, everybody can just relax at that moment, and the horns can also relax the tempo. So when you come in sul tasto with the violins, it has a more magical, almost shadow-like effect. Please, Mr. Huang, hello, thank you for being here.
Hello. I just want to add one thing to the topic, to the same place about the horn syncopations. I just checked the copy of the score of Leonard Bernstein, which you could find in the New York Philharmonic archive.
Yes, the archives.
It's clearly says like what 2 bars, 1 bar before M, no ritardando.
That's
so,
right.
Yeah, it's a matter of interpretation, but I think there was an intention of the composer, which he didn't write to slow down or anything.
Even if he had the intention to slow it down, it would have made it complicated. It would have made it difficult to keep it all together.
Sure.
By the way, thank you for mentioning Lenny. I studied this piece with Lenny for the first time.
Ah.
So he was my first teacher for this work. So I also have a very clear indication of LB, no ritardato.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for contributing that.
You're welcome.
Zhonghua, hello. Unmute your microphone. You have to press the microphone, unmute it. We don't hear you. Let me try it for you, Matt. Let me try it for you. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Maestro. I want on second question. First moment, Popa before forgot. Let's you know.
4 bars before what?
First moment, Popa before C.
Letter C.
Yes.
Okay.
The forgot basun. Let's sharp. One bar before C.
Yes.
Let's sharp. You can we play can play or not play le sharp?
You have an F sharp or you have a D sharp?
D sharp, D sharp.
Yes.
Or we play the le sharp.
I have
no.
I've not had any corrections made by bassoon players over the 20 years I've been conducting this work. So I think, as in the same thing before the big explosion, it's a question of whether the bassoon players can play it or not. If they can't, you can do the same thing that you have in another harmony. But if you'll notice, the cello are playing a D sharp.
I think
So-
about it missing no good player. No.
Yeah, it's very likely that they don't play at this moment because the cello. It depends on if the bassoon player can actually play it. It's a difficult note. I know what you're talking about. It's not normally in the register for the bassoon.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for bringing that up. That's always a good idea. Any other questions? Anybody? Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to remind you again that next week on Tuesday, the 18th, Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony, the 26th, Mahler's Sixth Symphony with two wonderful, great maestri, Even Goldberg Jensen, the music director of the Bergen Opera and the North Netherlands Symphony, and Gabriel Feltz, the music director of the theater in Kiel, in Dortmund, and in Belgrade. So some really fantastic maestri are going to be joining us. And then for those of you who want to put all this theory into practice, sign up if you're not already signed up for the Bucharest Conducting Academy. It's not just the Symphony 6, it's also Romeo and Juliet. It's also the Piano Concerto, it's the Polonaise from Onegin, the Serenade from Strings. We have a lot of Tchaikovsky to cover, and we really encourage you to come and perfect your podium performance in Bucharest. If there's no further questions, I want to say good night, Peter, and thank you all for participating in this seminar. It was really great seeing you all, and thanks again. Hope to see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.